Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by the two founders of WAI Architecture Think Tank, Cruz Garcia, who's a Puerto Rican architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and theorist, and Nathalie Frankowski, a French architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and poet. WAI Architecture Think Tank is a planetary studio practicing by questioning the political, historical, and material legacy and imperatives of architecture and urbanism. Founded in 2008, WAI is one of Garcia and Frankowski's several platforms of public engagement that include Intelligentsia, a Beijing-based anti-profit art space, and the free and alternative education platform and trade school, Loudreaders. Garcia and Frankowski are faculty at Virginia Polytechnic and State University and have held visiting professorships, fellowships, and chair positions at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Carnegie Mellon University, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the School of Architecture at Taliesin. Their work has been part of the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennale, as well as exhibitions at the MoMA in New York, the Neues Museum in Nuremberg, and the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon. They are authors of Narrative Architecture, a clinical manifesto, Pure Hardcore Icons, a manifesto on pure form and architecture, a manual of anti-racist architecture education, and the upcoming book From Black Square to Black Reason, a post-colonial architecture manifesto. Through the constant ethos of asking what about it, WAI Architecture Think Tank is a workshop for architecture intelligentsia that speculates on the possibility of workshops for anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-capitalist, anti-alienating, anti-imperialist, and anti-heteropatriarchal imaginaries. Finally, I'd like to thank Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their continued support of the student lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Cruz Garcia and Nathalie Frankowski.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and we're really happy to be here with you. Also, it's our first lecture in New York officially, and we're really happy that it was the students who invited us, which is really at the center and the core of our practice. And today's presentation is titled Post-Colonial Narratives and Other Loud Reading Manifestos. And then we're going to touch a bit about what post-colonial means to us. And it's not necessarily what is written in the New York Times and the fight that the French and the American academia have right now. And what role does narratives play in our practice? And what does loud reading means in a way? So we try to unpack all these 4 points as it goes.
Part 1, Clinical Narrative, 1968-2008. The fully developed ability to say no is also the only valid background for yes. And only through both does real freedom begin to take form.
And the first part is about history, consent, and who belongs in that history, and who is giving consent about architecture. And as we know, we are in the middle of I would say, a planetary crisis that is where gender, race, and the environment are at the middle. So we've been trying to figure out what's the relationship, or how can we start addressing the really urgent issues that are binding the protests behind Black Lives Matter all around the world, also with some sort of understanding of these landscapes, these necropolitical landscapes that are evidence of a regime that decides who gets to live and who doesn't, and how this also becomes a form of formalism in a way, as you can see in the era of necropolitics, where the conditions that were particular to the colonies have moved beyond the tropics. It's not you're not only going to find mass graves in the Amazon, as you can see in the left image, but actually here, the allegorical here in New York, right? So that's the condition where these sort of regimes of brutality and cruelty and extraction, they're not particular anymore to the colonies around the world, right? So it's something that the so-called first world is suffering, perhaps for the first time, and trying to understand also what is the legacy of representation and the images that we are consuming recently, right? And these are like pretty striking images that tell a lot. On one hand, this Q shaman, reappropriating the sort of the image of indigeneity in a settler colonial state like the United States, and this person carrying a Confederate flag in front of a politician that that got beat up in 1856 when he was arguing against he was arguing for the abolition of slavery. So the people that were for slavery, they as you can see, they can him in Congress. Understanding that this that happened on January 6th is not new, right? Like this wave of populists is not only something that happened in the last 4 years, but it's something that has been really at the core of many institutions around the world, right? Here is a picture with Wilders and Marine Le Pen. Not only looking at these people, but also understanding what is the relationship of architecture to this, right? What does it mean to have a neoliberal anthem like Yes is More, and collaborate with the people that own our information, our data, but also people that don't really care for life. And these are some quotes that Jair Bolsonaro has said about, why do Indians that are, sort of primitive people, they own so many resources in Brazil, right? So it's almost calling for their removal in a place that sees many hundreds and thousands of indigenous activists killed a year, right? So what does it mean that architects see no problem sometimes working for people like this, right? And also understanding the relationship between the loss of life, of human life, to the decay of the environment and vice versa, right? What does it mean when architects propose to master planet the world, right? From the people that brought us colonialism and chattel slavery, when they not only propose such kind of dangerous ideas, but the way that architecture and media deals with it, right? Where it's presented completely uncritically, where they are just saying that they are gonna master planet the world and they get all the platforms they want to do this, right? Like, so where do we stand when we're trying to understand the legacy of contemporary colonialism, right? On one hand, people like Elon Musk, when he got confronted about, organizing a coup against Evo Morales, something that he actually didn't do, but that he has in a sort of between humor and cynicism replies, we will coup whoever we want, deal with it, right? So what happens when the thin mask of that used to cover the ideology of the cynic is lifted, and all it's behind is just the plain ugly face of that sort of imperialist attitude. So to give you a bit of background about us, and I feel like a lot of the young people will be able to relate to this. We finished school in 2008, and I arrived to Europe 2 weeks before Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, right? So I enter the professional world, the adult world, in a really precarious financial, political, social, and cultural moment, right? This is a psychogeographic map of our first 12 years of practice. We met in Belgium, we moved to the Netherlands, to France, live in China for 7 years, where we were based in the center of Beijing, and later on we will return to Beijing to talk a bit about how important it is for our practice. And we went from a day being surrounded by people in a city of 20 million people to waking up in the middle of the core of the American imaginary, right? Like that sort of US imaginary that it is also quite problematic, right? So these are the rolling hills of the former home of Frank Lloyd Wright, where we were visiting teaching fellows or professors. That was our first teaching experience in the United States. And we were not only engaging with this kind of desolated landscapes with some kind of morbid history behind, with all these people that died there and all the sort of gossip about the place and the scandals, but also with a legacy of an imaginary of this architect as the genius, right? Like the idea of the single white, mostly white male genius that is gonna save the world, right? Like through architecture, right? And seeing all these pictures in all these documents and being confronted with this history was something that also allowed us to see how we position ourselves within the architectural imaginary, right? So in a way, not only we're dealing with all the contemporary questions, but also we had to sort of engage with its history, right? So our pedagogies are in a way a reflection and a rejection of that idea of the single male genius that is gonna save the world through architecture. We had the opportunity to engage with many different students from Arizona and from Wisconsin, and also through, with our students in Taliesin, also engage in a critical way with the history of the place, where our students were not anymore sort of copying or replicating the aesthetics and the sort of nostalgia for organic architecture, quote unquote, but actually asking questions about ecology, about aesthetics, about the politics behind all this sort of imaginary. These are some of the projects that they did once they finished in their thesis, right? Understanding all the ideas, even from desert masonry to labor and originality, right? These are a documentary we were a part of that we're showing because it is funny if it wouldn't be tragic, the title, right, of how these figures are engaged in history, right? There's so many wrong things here, right? But the fact that this documentary is called Frank Lloyd Wright, the man who built America, right? America not only being a country, right? Like sort of erasing a full continent or group of continents and imagining that it's possible for a man to build it, right? Like not only design it, but actually erasing also all that history of labor, right? As many institutions, in the struggle, Taliesin was closed by sort of neoliberal forces and sort of made us continue a series of questions that we had already in relationship to, finishing school in 2008. 40 years later, the 1968 was really important, right? With the civil rights movement, with Stonewall, with the Paris 68, the strikes in Mexico, and understanding that today, it is not so different what we're going through, right? Like when we see pictures, you put them next to each other or you go in the streets, you can tell that not much has really changed in 50 years, if you think about it. These are some pictures of Paris in 68, Paris in 2021, right? With the Gilets Noirs, a lot of sub-Saharan African workers asking for access to a more dignified life, or seeing the streets, right? As people are claiming the idea of public space that oftentimes is treated as a sort of private commodity for the privilege of few. Understanding the role of militarism in the streets, right? In the ideas of public space, right? And public for whom? Who makes that public? Who belongs in that conversation? Understanding that, again, as we can see, Baltimore in 68 and Baltimore, as we speak, it shows that in the real critical questions, we haven't moved too far. And we are still fighting for the same things. Maybe today we have the privilege to be in this screen and not being threatened by an angry mob outside, but that doesn't mean that disenfranchised communities are seeing the luxury of this, right? Understanding for us, who are the icons that we are going to study? Who are the philosophical centers that describe a different form of epistemology that will allow us to be critical, right? And as I said, understanding the risk they went through for us to be here today, right? And I am so lucky to be speaking to you through this Zoom screen, right? And not behind a bulletproof screen, as Angela Davis had to do in the 60s and 70s, right? Understanding, again, what stories have been swiped under the rug, right? Well, indigenous people taking over buildings, right, to reclaim the territory that was taken away from them, and understanding the intrinsic relationship between ideas, power, political and economical systems, and regimes of anti-Black oppression all around the world, right? Understanding, and this picture for me is really powerful because Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were killed when they were 2 years older than me. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated when he was 6 years younger than me. And Fred Hampton was almost half my age when he got killed, right? Understanding the danger that it presents to actually be a critical thinker, right? A word that we use in architecture loosely all the time, right? To reject the institutions and to question the systems of oppression, right? Understanding who was there before us and what can we do to somehow respond to that legacy and to that struggle. Right? Understand, I love this diagram too that Alfred, the critique that Hank Willis Thomas put. How can we question the tools that are given to us to understand what are we doing and where are we standing? In one side, you can see the diagram of Alfred Barr of Cubism and abstract art, where he completely depoliticizes art movements, and I'm sure that all of us have taken theory and history class, and that's quite common. And on the other hand, Hank Willis Thomas proposes colonialism and abstract art as this diagram that includes the the sort of colonial apparatus that was exploiting the Congo, that was fueling a lot of those movements that were happening in Europe, right? Understanding what is the relationship of these to even our own histories, right? On one side, you can see some of the mines in El Congo, right? And what happens when these sort of systems of exploitation and extraction don't happen in our front yard, when they move beyond the spaces we inhabit, right? It doesn't mean that the exploitation is over. You know, even to me, in a personal note, seeing this painting by Turner that perhaps many of you have seen, that at the beginning it looks like an abstract painting, but when you look in detail, you can see all the bodies of the corpses of the slaves that were thrown overboard. It is not only some sort of commentary on the history of that sort of transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, but in a very specific way, the economies that fuel these works are really intrinsically related to the same economies, right? And what is polemic about this, and perhaps you don't know, is that the owners of this painting sold it to the Museum of Art in Boston, and with the money they acquired from that sort of transaction, they bought a sugar plantation in Puerto Rico, right? So not only was the painting represented that sort of exploitation in a sort of artistic way, the money that fueled that transaction of art and the value of the art, you know, in relationship to the museum, fueled also other real physical models of exploitation, perhaps really close to the ones that Turner was addressing in his painting, right?
Achille Mbé argues in his provisional notes on the post-colony that the post-colony is made up of a series of corporate institutions and a political machinery which, once they are in place, constitute a distinctive regime of violence, and is characterized by a distinctive style of political improvisation, by a tendency to excess, and a lack of proportion, as well as by distinctive ways in which identities are multiplied, transformed, and put into circulation.
So for Achille Mbé, in his sort of notes on the post-colony, he talks about this political improvisation, this sort of excess, which is very important to the idea of the post-colony. But what we want to say is that for us, the post-colony is not necessarily what happens after the sort of colonial powers have left, but what happens when what happened in the colony becomes the norm everywhere else, right? What happens, you know, and I come from the oldest colony in the world. Puerto Rico was invaded in the second trip of Columbus in 1493, and has been a colony ever since, right? 400 years from Spain, 120 something years from the United States, right? Understanding that what happened in Puerto Rico some years ago with Hurricane Maria, when many people died, and we couldn't even count the people that died, and nobody really cared, happened also in the United States, right? In the leading economy of the world. So in a way, you can almost predict what is the condition of this post-colonial world by looking at what is happening in the colonies, right? When these sort of systems of exploitation and abuse get generalized. In a way, it's really similar. The installation that my former professor, Rafael Acevedo, led in front of the Capitol building, where they put 4,645 pairs of shoes in honor of all the lives that were lost and not even count at some point, and comparing them to the mass graves all around the world that are dealing with COVID, right? With many nameless people that have passed away. Understanding, you know, in Puerto Rico, in the protest before the first ousting of a political leader in our colonial history, Bad Bunny, the trap singer, pop star, was wearing already a plastic face shield and a mask 6 months before COVID was even discovered, right? Understanding what can we use to understand these images and project into them possible futures, right? I love also this poem, right? Understanding where can we look to make sense out of this? This poem by a Puerto Rican activist and poet, Raquel Salas Rivera, that is, we call it the anthem of necropolitics. It says, "Hey gringo, if you love death so much, why don't you marry it?" Right? I feel like this really captures the zeitgeist of the time, where we really don't care, where many of you are forced to go back into school because maybe the universities need tuition, or maybe they don't know what to do with all that spare time and all that money that they send to the military, right? In Puerto Rico, it has been really also important for us to figure out who are the leaders of these revolutions, right? And this is an amazing picture that is also a manifesto from one of the spokesperson of the feminist collective in construction. That is one of the leaders of sort of the activist movements in Puerto Rico, led by feminist, and the t-shirt reads anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American. And I feel like that's the core of our struggle for human emancipation. Understanding what are the icons and the effigies that are erected around the world, and what is the relationship between them and the great narratives of our times. On one hand, Ricky Martin waving the rainbow flag during the anti-governor protest, and the other one with the young collective of high schoolers that led all the protests in Pittsburgh, Black, young, and educated, leading the protest in Pittsburgh against police brutality. Understanding that this is nothing that belongs to the United States, but actually it's a global movement against oppression, right? As we can see in the pictures in Chile or in Puerto Rico. And understanding what is the relationship of architecture to this, right? Black Lives Matter is an architectural movement. Why? Because they're against buildings of policing and prisons, right? So understanding also what has more value in our imaginaries, if buildings or Black life, right? That's a really important question we have to ask ourselves. Understanding how doublethink, to quote George Orwell, works, right? When architects are allowed to claim that they design detention and correctional centers that facilitate the humane treatment and rehabilitation of inmates in a country that exponentially and asymmetrically incarcerates Black and brown people, right? Understanding that because architects are trained to provide services and to respond to clients, they're not able to question what types of architecture are they erecting. What is their contribution to the decay of the environment? And most importantly, how they're betraying the people that are really being custodians of the lands that are for themselves, right? Like when the Lakota people in the Dakota Access Pipeline were protesting against the pipeline, they were not protesting because they were protecting their land, right? But they were protecting the future of all of us, right? Understanding what is the relationship of architecture to this is really central if we really want to have critical practices in the future. Understanding what are the truly democratic forms of architecture, right? When we talk about democracy, we talk about voting and getting together, but rather what happens when people come together to bring things down that were put up undemocratically. And also these are a personal opinion, but these are some of my favorite architectures around the world, right? When people do get together to bring down monuments and effigies of racists and colonizers.
Part 2, Loudreaders, 1920-2020. The only purpose of education is to make new worlds collectively. This requires the practice of curiosity as a daily habit and the exercise of dignified and purposeful rebelliousness. Other worlds are possible.
Usually we ask a question when we show this image, if there's an audience, and we will ask, do you see the difference between the left picture and the right picture? And then some of you will say, yes, in the left picture, there's no women, right? So this is the problem with our sort of modernist legacy of education, right? In the Bauhaus, founded by Walter Gropius in 1919, Walter Gropius didn't believe that women could think in 3 dimensions. Therefore, they had to invent disciplines for them that would allow them to practice away from the fun disciplines of painting and sculpture and architecture, right? Women were sent to textiles, to ceramics, to photography. At the same time, and we don't learn about this, maybe because of our Russophobia or because of all the other theories around, a year before than the Bauhaus, in the small Jewish town of Vitebsk, in what is now known as Belarus, Marc Chagall founded the People's Art School. That was not only an institution that brought children and adults together to design and to learn about art making and the relationship of that to society, but it was also administered by a woman, right? So at the same time that Walter Gropius thought that women couldn't even do architecture, in Unobis, you know, in Vitebsk, Berar Molayeva was administering the school, right? She invited Kazimir Malievich and Lisitsky and founded one of the first collectives where people were signing together without having to take credit as authors, right? Which I think is something that is really important that we should be learning in school. At the very same time that this was happening, in the US colony of Puerto Rico, newly claimed from Spain in 1898, there was a practice of tobacco workers who would choose one among themselves that knew how to read for them during the entire workday. At the beginning, the literature that the lectores would read would be classics like Victor Hugo, but later on, they started reading political literature like Marx, Bakunin, Engels, and Kropotkin, and they will make syndicates to make strikes asking for better rights for workers, right? Leading this practice was Luisa Capetillo, a Puerto Rican anarcho-feminist, anarcho-syndicalist feminist that was arrested several times for wearing pants in public. Another thing, really interesting thing, I think, for everybody based in New York, Luisa Capetillo used to run a restaurant in New York and a boarding house where she would allow workers to stay there and serve delicious vegetarian meals for them, even if they didn't have any money, right? I feel like there's something beautiful, not only about reading revolutionary literature to workers, but also being able to provide basic services that are dignifying, right? This idea of the Loudreader also makes us question who is at the center of our forms of knowledge. What happens when we displace that idea of European modernism, right? Of Eurocentric epistemologies, and with other forms of imaginaries, with other ideas, in this case with Frantz Fanon, Silvia Rivera-Cusicanqui, Angela Davis, Achille Bembe, Sayak Valencia. And this has become at the center of our recently published Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education that we also published recently in Spanish, and you can download it from our web page for free, where we're wondering about this history that we've been sort of fed through our eyes and ears endlessly, right? That we keep on talking about Walter Gropius as the visionary founder, right? Without addressing all the shortcomings of these models of pedagogy and trying to map them in what Stefan Truby calls the political models, right? Where do the theories and ideas belong, right? In the left, in the right, in the anti-Semitic left, or in the anti-Semitic right, right? What happens when obviously people like Patrick Schumacher, that is doing I think this is the stupidest job in architecture, right? Where somebody is doing lectures around the world to defend capitalism as if capitalism needed him to defend it, right? Like it's not really obliterating everybody around the world, right? And understanding also what is the relationship to the legacy of some of the people that we have learned to appreciate in our institutions, right? In the case here in the Cooper Unit with Peter Eisenman, in a way, and all this idea of the singular, again, male genius that are gonna save us through architecture, right? Understanding also the role of other forms of institution. As Architecture New York used to bring all these architects to lecture around the world, mostly Western architects, mostly from the Ivy League schools, to lecture everybody about how architecture should be done and what these courses are important, right? When they're not able to make a critique of publishing and dedicating issues to a full-blown Nazi, right? And how these projects get recycled while promoting the same institutions and the same ideas, although with a more liberal face, right? Like as in the case of Log Magazine. Understanding what is the role of media in all of this. Our friend Justin Garrett Moore was presenting in a panel of urbanists and somebody went through the trouble of deleting him from the presentation, right? As you can see in the silhouette in the wall, right? So it reminds us why most of the panels of Annie or Log look like this. It's a bunch of white men and maybe one or two women sprinkled here and there. Sometimes those women also married to some of those singular male genius. Understanding also what is the role of aesthetics, right? And politics in all of this. Politics is always at the center of the decisions we take, even if we don't want to think about it, right? And things like the executive order promoting beautiful architecture makes it really obvious, right? What does beautiful mean? And beautiful for whom, right? That's always something that we also have to ask ourselves. What is the role also of the sort of, on one hand, of the erasure of Blackness, right? And the other one of the exploitation of it. On one hand, Julian Bonder and many other designers get commissioned to design monuments for Black slaves, but the word Black never appears and the projects are never given to Black designers or even invited to the competitions. Or in the other one, even liberal architects will invite Black youth to play with toy weapons in a plaza for the applause of other white people in a biennale, knowing that these very young children would have gotten shot by the police if they go there to play with toy weapons, right? Understanding what is the privilege, right? Understanding what are the new forms of critical theory, right? And this happened last week in Sayar when we lectured there, and we were talking about this completely sort of tone-deaf lecture discussion between Sylvia Lavin and Graham Harman, where they will talk about do all objects matter, and completely overlooking and sort of in a very cynical way overlooking what are the connotations of to talk about this in a completely apolitical way in the age of Black Lives Matter. Understanding what are the right-wing spaces, right? Spaces of exclusion, spaces of white heteronormative patriarchy, right? That are not only the gas chambers and the concentration camps and the detention centers, but architecture school has been that historically, right? It doesn't take much to look at any history of any architectural institution around the world to know that there was a bunch of men at the center and a lot of exclusion happening there, right? Understanding how this may not be very different to what we're living in now, right? And even if it is, right? And this is a question that we ask, if architectural schools and architectural institutions were formed as sort of manifestations of some form of heteronormative white supremacy space, when did they stop being that? And if they didn't stop, when are they gonna stop being that, right? Looking at when we talk about radical and critical, it's always just a bunch of dudes founding a school, right? Like it's always a power play between a bunch of men. And even here, you know, when we talk about the ghosts of the Cooper Union, right? It still remotes to that idea, right? Like the Haydukes and the Abrahams and the Peter Eisenmans and the Livius Woods and so on and so forth. Even our own colleague in Virginia Tech that we listened to when he's saying that non-referential architecture has nothing to do with being woke or with dystopias and critical theory or utopias. What does that mean, right? That we may believe that the great narratives that we're trying to fight when we're trying to breathe, when we're running out of breath, they're not really important, right? That there's a form of architecture that can save the world by ignoring all the big questions we're asking, right? What happens when we translate those diagrams that we have been learning through in history to what they really were, right? And we did this small exercise where we took the diagram of the Bauhaus, where it's supposedly divided by materials, and we substituted it for the disciplines that women were allowed to do or not. And then we found out that men were always at the top and in the center, right? Understanding how can we replace that? In our manual, we made this, instead of a closed circle, we propose a spiral that can always grow endlessly, and where anti-racism, anti-ableism, transfeminism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and ecological justice are at the center. So that every form of media, theory, history, and form has to be intersected through the spiral, right? So if we're learning from history in the Eurocentric way and it hasn't been intersected, it means that we're not really doing our work as critical thinkers, right? Or even taking this sort of a chronocartographic diagrams or the evolutionary trees of architecture, as George Jenks called them, where he presents styles devoid of political context, and we subvert it by proposing the chronocartography of anti-Black institutions around the world, right? And between Jim Crow and apartheid and white Australia policy, you can discover how this has been really present, but somehow overlooked in our discourses, right? Understanding how, by making this map, we can see how Philip Johnson attended at Hitler June's rally. The same year he founded the design and architecture department in MoMA, right? Trying to make reason why there were no Black designers in those collections, right? When you have basically a Nazi running the architectural ideas in a full country or even in the world. Part of the diagram, the manual is divided in 3 parts: before school, during school, and after school. And the before school addresses how important is access through the tuition fees to the schools, right? Understanding the power of certain institutions versus the communities that relate to them, either being countries or even being the cities in which these cities are on, right? Where these universities are on. And understanding when things are lost and when they should come back, right? Like, and something that you had at some point going for you was the free tuition, and hopefully you can bring that back, and hopefully many other institutions should join this sort of idea about education.
Decolonizing the university starts with the deprivatization and rehabilitation of a public space. The rearrangement of spatial relations Fanon spoke so eloquently about in the first chapter of Les damnés de la terre. It starts with a redefinition of what is public, what pertains to the realm of a common, and as such does not belong to anyone in particular, because it must be equally shared between equals. Post-colonial landscapes. Following the legacy of UNOVIS, we started also our own collective called Post-Novice, where the idea was to gather with a lot of people from different fields, different practitioners, and start different, what we call world-making events that would take place in many different landscapes. Relationship to the land is very interesting for us. So it's like, for example, like a series of what we call our propaganda posters that we did in various locations, and understanding also all the different forms of knowledge that are produced there in different contexts and different histories.
And as part of this critique of the people that were inspired by Alexander von Humboldt to discover the world through representation, we developed a series of projects that question the apolitical nature of landscape representation in the erasure of indigenous bodies and civilizations. And we started reinserting the militarized architectures that were left behind, right? So part of our project that questions that legacy of Manifest Destiny is what we call the post-colonial, sort of post-colonial narratives, right? In this case, started with a publication in 2016 and an exhibition called the Post-Colonial Room that we did in Nebraska in 2018 and 19, and eventually evolved in a series of images and sort of collages of those paintings that later on became a play. And this is a play that we're developing that we hope to present this year in Virginia Tech in the ICAT. And that became other types of projects or even collaborations during COVID. This was a collaboration that was born between United Nude, the sort of fashion brand, and us, as we were trying to collaborate in the era of COVID. And they were questioning the idea of fast fashion and trying to work with these forms that should travel to time. And us, we were working with the idea of these post-colonial landscapes. This is a much lighter project, but I think it's really important to see how we can use even these ideas to fuel other discourses, where we became the models of the project, and we inserted ourselves in these compositions with the sounds of the nature in Puerto Rico, as you can hear here, the local frog, and a series of poems we wrote on these post-colonial narratives.
A fantastic odyssey.
And eventually became a collaboration that is called A Fantastic Odyssey. And you can find it online mostly.
A Fantastic Odyssey. A narrative in 10 scenes. Among geometric shapes.
You can watch the video online, but pretty much it explains not only those landscapes with the designers behind the stage, but we're actually inserting ourselves in the center of the projects, right? So the narrative, it was an opportunity for a collaboration, but also that allow us to reflect in also the relationship of the bodies to these landscapes. Right now, also we have this installation in Venice that should open together with the Biennale, where 12 designers did a residency in a former building by John Hayduck that got demolished in a small Venetian island. And there we also had the opportunity to make an installation called Post-Colonial Victims. In the last iteration of MoMA PS1, that we see usually as a really depoliticized project, we also proposed to bring the idea of the migrating bodies, especially from the tropics to New York, and propose a summer garden or a post-colonial summer garden. These are our first collaboration in Omaha, Nebraska, in the first session of Loudreaders, or our collective Post-Novis, where we were reflecting on that the 100-year anniversary of UNOVIS and that sort of first collective, while inventing a form of pedagogical practice that would not happen inside the classroom or the architectural studio, but where all of our students were reflecting on that history and projecting what are the critical questions of today and tomorrow. This is a manifesto we published together in a series of events, manifesto readings, lecture series, and even our last physical lecture we did before COVID strike in Carnegie Mellon, where we turned the lecture into an installation and a propaganda sort of event for post-novice, where we're trying to recruit people to question the institutions and sort of the sort of free exchange of knowledge. And in relationship to this, and in the idea of the tobacco readers we read you about, after March in 2020, with the sort of stop of many institutions where they left the students hanging and many institutions closed and students were really left confused, we figured out that we could use Zoom and YouTube and all the sort of platforms of online communication to generate a free and alternative platform of architectural education that we call Loudreaders. So if you go there online in loudreaders.com, you will find all the workshops and lectures that have been done by many speakers from all around the world. And it's still ongoing. We have some events coming soon. And the idea is that we try to bring all these critical discourses and ways of doing and making architecture and thinking about architecture and bring them to a platform that is completely accessible or fully is free. So it still have problems of accessibility, of course, because not everybody has internet, but we're trying to think about how we can address that. There's some of the sessions, sometimes students getting together, sometimes many architects and designers and writers and poets coming and reading about many different critical literatures or works that are really central to their practices. And soon we will have an event and 3 Loudreader sessions by Cordaya Tafa-Henry, Liu Yujia, Pedro Neves Marquez, and Raquel Salas Rivera, where 3 filmmakers and 1 poet are going to generate an installation in Virginia Tech. And we will have 1 Loudreader session for everybody. So we also would like to invite all of you to join us. This Loudreaders platform also allows us to generate, it's a free platform where we can share things like our anti-racist architecture manifesto and other pieces that have become really central in other languages. Also, I had the opportunity to become a Loudreader in real space in Pittsburgh, where a series of activists based in Pittsburgh invited me to also read or loud read the ideas that are in this manifesto that talk about the relationship of the city, oppression, algorithms, data, and institutions, and the fight that we are trying to sort of carry out in the streets and the reclaiming of the public space for the real public. These are some of the events also where I had the chance to collaborate with people that are really doing really serious work, even if we look like we're having fun there.
Also following the legacy of the Loudreaders, this is an example of a studio we run at Carnegie Mellon when all the students became like a contemporary lectores, Loudreaders, and we asked them to create a collective campus and to think of different laboratories and ways to activate the landscape and the public programs in relationship to what topics would they like to loud read in contemporary time. So that's like one of the last physical pinup we could have together before COVID started. But what was interesting is that a lot of topics that after became really central to our summer 2020 were already like very central to the questioning of the students. For example, that's a laboratory done by Taylor Latime, where she was questioning the importance of art as an emancipating tool for Blackness and how also to create a space for discussion. Or Christopher Elric, who did a laboratory for rioting and all the different platforms and programs that are linked to it. Or Crystal Shu questioning the role of social media and with all the system that goes with it around data and facial recognition. Cassandra Howard dealing with the idea of land reparation and the question of our relationship with food and how can architecture kind of bridge the gap between that and how can we understand how to build communities that are closer to our land and to our modes of production, especially food production. Zi Chen questioning the idea of the American dream in different kind of setting. Or also like a lot of different types of engagement that we had the opportunity to have with different publics. So that's, for example, like some of the workshops we did with kids, children from younger age, around also like different types of topic, thinking of what does it mean to use also a tool of narrative to question the city and the environment where you live. So collage making, stories making, but also go around a series of books for children that we are developing, but also like offer a different kind of criticism in understanding how cities are built and how society can come together. That's like one of the also favorite installation called Palace of Megalith that we did, and where we could run different types of workshop, also with kids from different age group, and understanding what does it mean to come together to build and to question what type of programs can we have in a space that is built for all of us. So it's like a lot of pictures of a lot of these settings. Part 3, Form and Media, 2008. The limits of my language means the limit of my world.
And these two parts, the last two parts, we're gonna show them fairly quick, but it's to show you how also we think about all these ideas, and form is also at the center there, right? So when people think that formalism and form is something that was brought up, particularly from Europe, we always laugh about it, right? And I love this hieroglyph from of a cat in Nazca in Peru, right? Like to show that form making is a really human thing, right? And all it takes for us is really to understand our connections, right, between publishing and the role of media in this, installation making, form making in the land, and how can we really understand the political implications and the sort of ideological history of this media, and how can we use it, right, employ it, teach about it, and work with it, right? These are some of our publications that for us publishing is really important, and in many different languages, always like designing with collaborators and so on, from self-published publications to like working with publishing houses. Also exhibiting is also really central to those discourses. This is our first exhibition in 2011 that we self-initiated when like literally nobody had a clue who we were. So we showed this and we didn't even know if people were gonna come to our first installation in the Chicago Biennale in 2015, where some of these ideas were presented in the wall of manifestos, to later on our book on narrative architecture that we published last year, where it's questioning the legacy of critical narratives and how they can question ideology in architecture. So we would have done like a full book release last year of many books release of this, but then everything happened. So we start writing other type of publication later on with the Manual of Anti-Racist Education and so on. And also understanding the legacy of form and the relationship to power, right? And ideology and utopias. This is a collage we made. We started working in 2011 in it. It's called Cities of the Vanguard. We show an iteration of it in the MAT in Lisbon. And later on, we were invited to reflect on it 120 years in the museum of the newest museum in Nuremberg, and where we did our largest mural to date of these sort of utopian ideas. Trying to use that media to try to find the critical relationship between these urban sort of ideas, dreams, and nightmares that have been generated. And understanding again the relationship of form to power. I know that many of you saw that sort of spiraling tower ziggurat of Amazon, right? But understanding how it relates to the Tatlin Tower is really important, right? How neoliberalism recycles everything and strips it out of its original ideologies is also really central at our work, as you can see in these post-ideological postcards. It's a book that we published in 2013 in London, where we also designed the book, which we also have a really nice opportunity to engage with the manifesto as form making. And the Chinese edition that should come out this year has extra interviews, an exhibition we did in Beijing about it, and how this has been central, got translated into German by Arch Plus in the 40th year anniversary of the magazine in 2014, and a series of exhibitions we've done in Germany. When we have opportunities to propose this as a playgrounds, right, where we're trying to understand the role of form in that relationship that we have to it, and a publication we did in Sevilla in 2014. where we're trying to strip form to a universal vocabulary where it doesn't mean anything anymore, and words and forms can come together across many different scales.
So that's different installation that we done also following this idea of exploration with form. Part 4, platform, spaces for pedagogy. Since each of us was several, we were already quite a crowd.
And we show this, I think that this has particular value maybe for the students. When we were in 2015, we submitted a proposal for the competition of the largest museum in Russia. That was the National Center for Contemporary Art. And somehow we made it to the final, right? We were the only non-Russian, non-famous studio. And then we were brought to Russia, and then we said, like, we can design this thing, make it really open to the public. We proposed to put all the galleries in the second level, open all the grounds so people can walk and don't have to pay the ticket to go and see art. So it was like a real sort of aiming to have a real public space of art, where even if the client would have gotten the museum they wanted, we still would be able to sort of challenge the sort of privatization of art spaces. At the end, we didn't end up winning the competition, and we were kind of heartbroken when we returned, even if, it was the biggest fee we ever gotten, and we were kind of exposed to knowing that we were able to produce with our own hands content that would allow us to get so far in a competition. But instead of just letting the sorrow drown us, what we thought when we returned to Beijing is, can we make this program with almost no money? And then we came up with the idea of generating a gallery in the center of the city, as opposed to the galleries in the periphery that are much more institutional and commercial, where we can have a truly free space of discourse and positions in the center of Beijing. And then we invented the program of Intelligentsia Gallery, and we got around 200 artists from all around the world through 3 years, where we created many different exhibitions, not only in our own little space that became a hub of critical thinking and critical sort of positioning in art production, architecture, and so on in Beijing, where we have artists from all around the world showing in the group exhibitions. As you can see, this was the second year anniversary. A great event is in the making, but no one has noticed, that we borrow from Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities. And we put all these works from Russian photographers working with the post-ideological architectures in Russia, or French artists, or African artists working with some form of materialism, and made all these group exhibitions where we would invite poets and writers to sort of write about them. And it became really central to the discourse of art in China. After this, we were like 12 small galleries that opened around it. And this led us to being invited by larger institutions to do bigger shows, right? So these are some of the ones that happen in our space, as you can see. And then we started curating shows in larger museums and cultural centers, following that anti-profit spirit, and really catering to having some form of critical positioning within these institutions. So there were mostly non-commercial, anti-profit exhibitions where we could also discuss things that were urgent to us and our work, engaging with architecture, poetry, photography, and many other forms of media. This exhibition dealing with the language and the reduction of language, called Hypertext. We have like filmmakers, architects, poets, artists working together. These are, I think these are a really great example of two artists, one of them working in Mexico with the underground economies, with the good as gold, and an artist from Inner Mongolia, where he has this stone pieces carved that reads in Mongolian, "The dream is over." You really know where you are for the first time in history. Another group show we created, where we included many architects and poets again, and artists and filmmakers together. This is a project that we proposed to do. So after the success of our first gallery, we got invited to sort of rehabilitate and renovate a former courtyard home in the center of Beijing, in the Dashelar district. And they wanted us to make a gallery. We noticed that the neighbors didn't have toilets and access to kitchens and so on. So we proposed to the developer that the only way that we can do a gallery here is if they invest in improving the conditions of the neighbors, so we can build toilets and kitchens and so on. So we proposed the condenser for art, architecture, and spatial investigations as a gallery space and a residency center. We did an exhibition in the space as it was to show that it was possible to run a program there. And then we made all the drawings and all the sort of images and developed the project. And at the end, the developer didn't want to invest money on the neighbor, so we had to decline the project.
That's one
This is our last project.
It's the last project we're going to present to you. And it's one of our latest projects. So we had the opportunity to develop like a program with the current director of business
For the International Business
Program in Nebraska, where the idea was really to propose a kind of new way of thinking education. So the idea was to create like two different types of schools that could be implemented either in Nebraska or in Nigeria, in order to also to try to foster exchanges between those two places.
The professor is originally from Nigeria.
So we worked around the project, thinking of it in a modular format, so we could also be more flexible with a place where it could locate, and also think of it as being potentially developed in different stages. And what really interested us is like what was really in the center of the pedagogical approach was two core values: agriculture and art. So the idea was like really to work and to think the architecture around those two components. So every building was open to outdoors and to different plots of land where production of food could take place. And every building was an art spaces. And also like offering like flexible spaces where you could have like classes, but also hold different types of event, education, workshops. And that's also very centered in our practice, is how to rethink education, where we can really have different kinds of exchanges happening between children, between adults, that is much more rich than just the bottom down education system. And what type of tools also can be brought to understand what type of environment are we growing in. So again, like the relationship with the land is also something very interesting, which we can see in a lot of debates that is happening right now, and how to bridge again this kind of gap that was created.
That's all for the presentation. So we'd be happy to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really great. If anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to jump in, or if you'd like, you can put questions into the chat and I'll call on you to read them out.
Hey, first of all, I would like to say thank you to the presenters. And second of all, I would like to ask, how did you guys met? Un abrazo a los dos.
That's wild. So we met in Belgium working. So that was our first job. Yeah, we thought that where we were working, it was we didn't agree so much with what was happening, but that we knew that we had things in common, that we wanted to have a sort of critical practice that was asking questions, and we wanted to write, and we wanted to make film, and it didn't look like a conventional architectural practice will be allowing you to do that, apart from doing buildings, that we also like to design. And we have many other questions about pedagogy and things that somehow at the end it makes sense that you do it. So we met and we sort of found that we had all those things in common, things that we have in common and things that we also hated in common. So it makes sense. So that was in Brussels in 2008.
Also, we were both like just out of school, so it was like and as Cruz was presenting in the slide, it was like a really special moment to go out in the professional world, because it was like a economical crisis of 2008. And I think the combination of this and both being really just out of our last years, where we Cruz had the opportunity also to create a more critical thesis as his last project before going out of school. And I was also working already with different kind of mediums, like exploring the idea of movie making, writing. And I think like just the combination of this really made us really want to do our own projects really early on.
Yeah.
So.
But we needed to be in Brussels, so it was a half coincidence.
For me, it was easier, but for Cruz, was a little.
For me, it was a big jump because it's far from Puerto
Rican.
Jump.
I have a question about your practice specifically. I'm curious about your pretty prevalent use of the prefix anti, A-N-T-I, as opposed to things like post or D. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's an easy question. I feel like there's a lot of ambiguity and opportunism in architecture, especially in discourses, right? Where maybe to not burn bridges, or maybe because that's how the discipline works, people try to kind of pander to confusion, right? And to not be really politically engaged, because that can get you in trouble with the powers that be. And we are really anti that in a way as people. So I think it's like our practice is a lot about what we don't want to do, and everything else is kind of open. So we don't know what's the plan. There's no 10-year plan or 100-year plan, but there's a bunch of things. I don't want to do prisons. I don't want to do detention centers. I am anti-racist. I wish that I can be practice anti-heteropatriarchal or whatever. I am anti-capitalist, right? Like I really despise social and economic system. So it is very clear, right? Like also, me as a person, there's no much grace in my character. So everything is like, if I can really point to a problem, I won't try to be ambiguous about it. Even if maybe when I was in school, that was kind of cool, in the precious years of neoliberal architecture, when architects could go around the world and do big projects and not really stand where they stayed, where they're standing politically was okay. For me, it was always like, I don't want to do this. This is such a weird thing, right? Like, I don't agree with this. Maybe I'll die of hunger because I cannot get a job if this is a job, right? Like this is the profession, and I cannot do this profession. So I think that's like the anti thing, right? Also, a lot of people that I admire in history, they're really anti stuff. Like Angela Davis, right? She's a Black feminist communist in the 60s in the US, clearly anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, that got her in trouble, right? So how can I be a part of that legacy, right? If I'm, of course, with less important than them, but contribute in a way. So I feel like if I'm not anti the things that they were fighting against, I'm betraying them, right? That legacy of struggle and fight. So it's not so much about, yes, I want a beautiful world. Everybody wants that, but sometimes the beautiful world somebody means like a genocide, right? So I don't necessarily want a beautiful world. I want a world where these things disappear, right? Like, and they have names, and I can point to them. So we are anti them.
Because also it's a bit like when you write a manifesto, being anti, I think it's like you need to compromise yourself into naming it. But it's also important for us because it means that we don't want to be just in a position of being against, but we want to try as much as we can to be actively against it. So also for us, it's important to reframe a lot of what we do around that, because if we state it, then it's for us, it's our responsibility to try to act upon this. And when you think of a word, right, anti-racism compared to not being, for racism, I think it kind of takes a stronger stand. And I think in a lot of discussions that are happening today around a lot of events that is happening, and I think it's really important that those words are being said and that we understand why we're using those words, and also taking the time to listen to others who use those words, because there's a really strong reason why we need to be anti in this world.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hey, thanks so much for the lecture. My question was just about how related to your practice is making architectural education more accessible. And you touched briefly on the loud speakers.
Loudreaders.
Loudreaders. Yeah, sorry.
Everybody calls them loudspeakers. I think loudspeakers are a much more common word.
It's a great name.
Loudreaders is, Loudreaders. Education is at the center of everything we do. Like, also to give you a bit of context, like my both parents are teachers. Nathalie's both parents are also teachers, right? At different levels, like college or kids or whatever, but public education, and we put it there. When we talk about the colonization and the colonizing, there needs to be free access to education, right? Because if we value education and we only keep it away from some people, then we're not doing anything. It's just fake, right? So for us since the beginning, it has been a process of how to think about education through practice, right? Where teaching and practicing has no separation in a way, because everything is always like questioning how is accessible, how, also it's not like, don't get me wrong, it's not like we are the teachers, right? Like part of our Post-Novice manifesto says all the students are the teacher, but providing spaces where knowledge is exchanged freely, right? Where we are really exchanging knowledge and we are really learning together. I feel like that's fundamental. And we try to like find forms how to do that. Like it could be Loudreaders, right? With an online platform where we use Zoom and maybe the infrastructure of the institutions and the people we know, because we are lucky to meet many interesting people around the world, but also, you know, do all those children playground sort of installations that are also fundamental to us. Like the one we show with the cubes, I always remember when we did the installation, people will come in, adults will come in the room and they will be stuck looking at the things without knowing what to do with them, right? They already been sort of indoctrinated in some form of behavior. Kids will come and they will like just make whatever came to like their spontaneous minds, right? And that was a really like teaching moment for us. Like, you know, this is it, you know, the trick is, and they will work together, you know, very little kids, like, because it's fun, they can carry it. Very little kids, like 2 or 3 years old or even smaller, carrying the block, you know, and a 12-year-old working with him, you know, in the moment. So you can see how these things happen naturally. And how can we use that as a learning moment for us, you know, when we're also teaching other level students, like, or working with colleagues and so on. So that's also really fundamental.
I think education is really like a core of what we do, but as Cruz mentioned, like in many ways and many directions, like we also, all those platforms are also for us to learn and to exchange on different kinds of topics, because I think, well, when you think of education, and to quote like Paulo Freire, when he says education is freedom, but how can we really go back to value education in that way? And how can we really like, again, like foster different platform of exchanges, right? Where we can find like forms of emancipation or questioning or discussion that could come out of this in many different ways with many different publics. And I think that's also thinking of a lot of different projects that we did around that. It was also built on these ideas. It's really kind of, you know, creating new networks, networks of solidarity where we can learn together, right?
And not only higher learning, right? Like this is also something that for us is fundamental. And this is a question we ask to our students sometimes. And when we're doing workshops and stuff like that, we ask like, did you know about architecture before you went to college or to university? Many people don't, right? I didn't, right?
Right.
But do you think that your life is affected by architecture before you get to college?
Of course, yeah.
Right? So why are we not learning about it? This is the fundamental question, right? Like why is it adults that are learning about architecture when all of our lives are affected by it? So
right, and it's critical to anti like just dismantling like colonialization and stuff.
Exactly, you know, and so many issues that come embedded with like who gets access to that knowledge, who is allowed to control that knowledge, who gets that power and accessibility, right? There's so many things that are imbricated in that relationship of who is allowed to do it. That historically has been a certain type of person, but it's still not really open, even if we like bring more people that look different into the institutions, right?
Right. Even the developers, they're the ones who are choosing what,
Yeah.
you know, goes into the community, it's not a conversation or an opportunity for education. So I appreciate both of your responses.
Priscilla, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you so much for your presentation. I saw you have done like so much projects, beautiful projects. Congratulations. So I have two questions. The first one is what kind of advice you can give to us, because you graduated in 2008 during the financial crisis, and so many of us are graduating now, and we are living also almost the same crisis right now. So what are the advices you can give to us who is graduating, and what are the challenges you face on your like daily life or from project to project? Thank you.
I'll start with the first one. The second one is like, it's like endless. I think that, I must say that I'm not a fan of this type of question, because it would be patronizing of me or of us to tell you how to deal with the world right now, because I have no clue, to be honest with you. I can tell you what we did, and there was a lot of luck involved. And one thing that we did, and maybe many of you are late in this, we didn't have debt when we got out of school. And we have to be honest with you, right? One thing that allows us freedom to, sometimes I say like, I'm not gonna work, for this guy, I hate it, I'm leaving, is that I didn't have to pay debt. Like I went to a public school, both of us study for free, like Nathalie in France and me in Puerto Rico. So I'm telling you from a position of privilege in that way, right? Where I finished school and I didn't owe $100,000 like I know some people owe. That's really liberating. Even if I was in a circus and I was having a hard time many times, I didn't have that burden, right? I was in another country, I was out of visa in Europe many times, and like they didn't care because I have an American passport, so it was okay. So I have many things that were lucky. I also encountered many assholes. I have a racist boss that I hated, and I had to leave a country because of that. It was really difficult. What I can recommend you to do is to be informed and to take decisions informed. Sometimes we feel like we only can do a certain type of practice because that's all we know. And that's not freedom, right? When we feel like we have to get this type of job, I had to get licensed, I had to work for this corporate, so whatever. That's fine if you want to do that, I had to say, but it's not because that's the only option you have. There's as many ways to practice architecture as there are people in this world, because everybody has a different interest and a different question. Therefore, you can generate an architectural practice that is shaped like that. And I don't know what those practices look like. How to fund things, there's ways. Sometimes we will work for an architect. We're lucky to work with great architects at some point, architects that we consider like great designers, or like sometimes great people and also great designers together. It allows us to work with them while we're doing our own projects at the same time. We were two, so also that's an advantage we have, right? So sometimes one of us will compromise and will be like working for somebody while both of us were doing crazy projects that were spending all that money, right? So there's a lot of strategizing. There's a lot of improvisation. Like something didn't work, we didn't try to make it work. We just left, went somewhere else, because we could do it sometimes, right? There were also, I think like, again, knowledge is power. If you can get knowledge for free, now is the best moment for Zoom lectures, right?
Yes.
That's really valuable. And it's not a joke. And I feel like most of us don't know how to use it, and we're not taking advantage of it, and it may go away. You never know when you listen to somebody that changed your life and flip your world upside down, and all of a sudden you have a completely perspective about what you want to do, and you saw it for free, right? In the 70s, you had to go to the AA and pay a lot of money and be there with a bunch of snob people in a really fancy school in London, right? We don't have to do that anymore, right? So how can we use this tools of technology that are also used to exploit us, and reclaim them to generate models of solidarity and knowledge exchange that is, it could be truly revolutionary, right? Because your generation will be unlike any other we ever seen, because you may be one of the most informed generations in the world, where you can be listening to Achille Mbembe live in one day, and 5 minutes later you switch and you're listening to us that nobody knows who they are, you know, right? Like, so it is a really unique opportunity where if we are malicious enough in that way, we can use that, right? So like, it's not networking in the capitalist sense, it's really like finding the knowledge that is gonna give you options for you to be empowered when you take decisions. So I feel like that's you want to add to that part?
I think I agree, and again, it's very tricky, because of course we know that you know, all the paths are very personal, and the amount of risk that one can take also is something very personal. But I just want to add also that it takes time, but that's okay too, because I feel like you know, sometimes when we're just out of school, we kind of want to
the
think
rush
that
is a competition and whatever, right?
because there is, but also there's options, and it's a long path. Architecture, especially architecture as a profession, I feel that it's a long path
It's
too,
like life.
which means that you can do, it's okay to fail, it's okay to try, it's okay to have different paths and to try different things and to learn along the way, sorry, because we always learn from different types of experience. And after because I feel like sometimes it's easier, as Cruz mentioned, to try to identify what we don't want to do, or what, you know, what doesn't really work for us, than to already know exactly how we want to practice, especially thinking of architecture, which is, you know, a very wide field, and there's many different people who approach architecture in very many different various ways. So I think also taking the time to try to learn what we want to do in the field, and also learn the possibilities that are out there, is also like a good way to approach it.
And then with the challenges that you ask, I mean, there are also as many challenges as there's people in life, right? Because you're gonna find people that completely disagree with what you want to do, people that have different interests. If you're working in architecture, it's kind of a weird discipline where you're mostly working with people with power, trying to relocate that power to the people, especially if you're working in our side, you know, in the type of project we're interested to do. That's really strange, right? Money is accumulated in the hands of few, but at the end you want to make things for the public, and the public is not going to pay you for it. So how can you operate like that? So of course everything is a challenge, and of course we haven't achieved all the things that we do, or not even a 0.0001% of it, right? Like we are, like, for every project that we managed to do that we find that is kind of interesting, there's like 200,000 things that we couldn't do because the resources are not there, because people don't want us in a certain space, because there's the things that we want to do, they haven't been done in a certain way, right? The institutions are really slow and really antiquated, and they are like poisonous, right? For people sometimes that think in a certain way. So there's many challenges, but also, you know, and this corny as hell, what I'm gonna say, but I'm gonna quote Achille Mbembe that says, it's a really amazing time for creativity. Why? Because we don't even know where we're going. Like, we don't know what's happening in 2 months, right? So we really need to think critically about what are the possibilities of that future, right? And it's in your hands, right? I feel like we're almost too old for this, right? Like, it is in your hands, and the generations that are coming after, and people that haven't even been born yet, right? Where we really need to think for a world that is not even for us, right? And that means that there's gonna be a bunch of challenges, from the ecology to like all the struggles that we're fighting right now, you know, race, gender, ecology, politics, economy, right? Like, they are all like in that spiral intersecting. So yeah, I cannot name you the challenges, right? But again, you know, being informed and taking decisions that allow you freedom. When you work for somebody, they're buying your time, right? How much time do we have? And how can we use our time for ourselves, right? And this is a very Marxist quote, but how can you control your means of production, right? So at least what you're doing is fulfilling for you, and it leads you to a future that you could be a part of, right? Because if you're only giving your time to be the future of somebody else that is not yours, it's kind of, I mean, that is not even the people that you care about, it's kind of pointless, right? So how can we engage with those challenges? Then we need to be informed. We need to like expand our resources, expand our tools of knowledge, our tools of presentation and representation, and then, you know, it's like weaponize the fight, right? Like really try to engage with all those really urgent questions in a critical way. Yeah, I mean, endless challenges, endless opportunities.
And I think
Thank you so much.
I feel also it's true. You know, the field is changing, life is changing all the time, the world is changing. So also what's exciting, if you want also to take it also in a more optimist way, is knowing that you will change also the field in the way you practice. So if you don't also know exactly how to practice, or find people who practice like you want to practice, then you can make it, right? We always say other worlds are possible, but it's always something that we believe in.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
I think Carmina's question was answered, so we'll go to Mauricio.
Thank you. So Natalie and Cruz, thank you so much for an amazing presentation, and also for just the way it was delivered. I just felt the same, you know, the emphasis is right on point. So thank you for that. So I'm thinking, I want to engage you on a more like an imaginary level. I'm thinking about the tropical plants that, from looking at your presentation, seem to be ubiquitous in your visual practice. I should say that rather than a challenge, my question comes from a shared penchant and love for drawing banana plants that I was born around.
Where are you from?
I'm from Colombia, Urabá.
Okay.
Beyond the stylistic iconography of tropicalia, which in a way localizes the form of power in tropical regions as the imaginary left by plantations as the productive means of colonialism, these plants are the remnant of monocultural or anti-cultural articulations of modern agricultural practices to meet the demands of excess. Anna Tsing, in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, touches on the plantation and the organization it brings with it as a way in which colonialism sought to scale up production. The question being, though we share a love for these plants, they are icons of the excesses of colonial power. How do you suggest to decolonize bananas, palms, and tobacco? Or another less analogical way of asking my question would be, how do we engage and reappropriate our local forms of care when they are seen primarily as modes of production from an outside perspective, i.e. decolonial discourse for us is a matter of care, whereas for institutions, it is a form of public and image management?
I love your question. I agree with you every 100%, everything you say about the plantation, right? Like, you know, our theory of the post-colony is basically that, right? Like, what we're projecting in these images is not what happened after the colony, but rather what happens when the colony is like turned into the status quo, which is where I feel like COVID is the perfect example. The use of plants for us, it has a very particular property. Like, if anybody knows me personally, I'm not really the plant type of guy. You know, I'm like, I grew up in a city. I only live in cities. I have a very unnatural relationship to nature. Like, when I live in Wisconsin, I felt the most out of place person ever. Like, I've never been surrounded by so many plants, right? Like, I don't know how to identify what is gonna kill me. I'm kind of useless, right? Like, I'm an urban useless person when it comes to that. I feel on one hand, to your question of and it relates to this, your question of the capitalism as a production and exploitation, right? Laziness is the answer. So that's a short answer, right? We are proponents for laziness, even if we are really terrible at it. But we spent a full semester last semester, you know, in Illinois discussing, you know, laziness as an anti-capitalist project. We read Mladen Stilinovic, In Place of Laziness, Kazimir Malevich, you know, Russell, you know, we read, you know, read Marx or like Frederici or whatever you want to read, right? Like, the idea that laziness presents a challenge to productivity and to accumulation and so on is really fundamental on one hand, right? So that's the production question on one hand. The other one, for us, the imaginary of these icons of Tropicalia, right, of the tropical plants and so on, we are playing with the legacy of the commodification, fetishization and historicization of tropical plants, right? In the way that they represent something that everybody can possess. And I ask this also, you know, a lot of our workshops and a publication we're working on right now that should be out before the summer. That is in a seminar we're teaching called Post-Colonial Landscapes. It is that idea that if you ask somebody, do you have plants in the house, or if you see a plants in an office, what are they? They're always tropical plants, right? Everybody owns tropical bodies except the people and the subjects that are from there, right? Like there is this complete appropriation and exploitation of that symbol, right? There's a lot of artists that we love. You know, I love Marcel Broders, the Belgian artist working, you know, with the colonial legacy of Congo and Belgium. He uses all these plants, right? So there's a lot of references within art, but also there's a complete sort of admission and sort of play with the tropical subject and the colonial subject. Like me being on one hand, right? Like me as a person, I am that in the same way that a palm tree is that too. You know, I feel like a potted palm tree in a room where I'm in an architectural environment, right? Like it is what it is, you know, like institutions may see me like that too, right? The fact that we have lectured so much this year because Black Lives Matter happened is evidence of that, right? Because as we show you today, we've been making work for 12 years that is pretty consistent in a way, like a lot of work that is asking these questions, you know, the post-coloniality, form making, ideology and politics. But it was at some point where we were thinking, you know, when I think this relates to the previous question, if we should retire at 30, because we were publishing almost a book per year and nobody cared. It was like, to whom are we talking to? There's like a complete, like nobody cares about what we're doing. So how are we gonna survive out of making this, right? So there is this acknowledgement of some precarious condition, but also there's some power in the ideologies that image carries, right? And I feel like if we acknowledge that power, we may be able to play with it, subvert it, maybe infiltrate. I don't know, maybe it's a failed project, like, you know, like most of the projects, but it is a vehicle that we can use, right? It's also a weapon. For me, like a banana plant and a palm tree is a weapon, because every time I see it somewhere, I can just go and slap it in front of, in the face of whatever institution is using it, right? Because they don't even know why it's there, right? So it's almost like allowing us a way in and kind of being able to tear the thing, you know, into pieces because of that, right? Like it's almost like it's an extension of the body that you can turn into part of a project that is subversive. And you know, we don't talk too much about the colonial, because I don't believe in the way that is approached. So that's why we talk about the post-colonial. Like, we lost, so what we're gonna do about it, right? As Achille Mbembe also says, you know, like, what do we do? Who owns the earth? And what do we do with the people that don't have a claim to it? Right? So that's how I feel about those tropical plants, right? They are what belongs to that, right? So what can we do about it? Can we rebel with plants? Can we make a tropical plant revolution, right? I also love the lack of understanding of it. I love that you brought it, because I mean, it is evident, but it's not so evident for a lot of people, right? And I feel like, you know, to quote Edouard Glissant, when in the Poetics of Relation, when he talks about the opacity, right? Like the right to opacity, the right we have to not be transparent, to not be decoded, to not be understood. That's really fundamental, right? So playing with those symbols that obviously are misunderstood and opaque to a lot of people are also an extension of that argument, right? You think that you understand the tropics, you think you understand the colonies, but actually you don't, right? Like there's all these layers that are behind those layers of opacity.
And to build on that, just to add also another quote of Achille Mbembe, but also that we found really interesting, is that he says that we cannot really speak of, you know, theory or history without speaking of geohistory or geotheory. So for us, landscape always has been very central to our work, because through landscape you understand the human relation to land that led to politics of extraction, or politics of oppression, politics of colonialization, politics of evasion. And when you think about it, everything really is centered around the ground, and all the system that is created from the idea of owning a land. And working with landscape allows us to also tackle a lot of those different issues, as you were saying, like also the idea of what a tool of representation can carry as ideology. And it's something also that is really present in our work, where we subvert all the paintings that were made in order to kind of enhance this gaze on the exactness, right? The idea of the land to be conquered, to be colonized, and how can we reverse it and subvert it, and, as Cruz mentioned, really use it as a tool to offer new narrative and new imaginaries. And the same goes with the plants, as you were mentioning. It's like a lot, when we think of also like Frantz Fanon, who speaks a lot about it, he speaks also a lot about all the kind of objectivization, that is done not just around the plants, but of course around the human body. And for us to work with plants is also a way to address it.
A political way.
A politically
way
engaged
way.
Especially the potted plant, when we put it in an installation, for example, because it's a plant that was displaced, is a plant that is put there to offer like a different type of gaze. So for us, it's really interesting to engage with all these different tools that we can use.
And when we say like everything is political, plants are, obviously, right? So even that, right? Like it is part of or even that, not even more importantly that, right? Like it is really central to that sort of argument of the post-colonial imaginary.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Are you guys fine to do one more question?
We're good. Yeah, I mean, we're good.
Okay.
And I saw that also Jesus, he wants to ask one too, but so if you have one there and we can.
No, that's the two was.
Hey, you guys.
Hey.
Great lecture, amazing. I absolutely loved everything. So quick question. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, because I know Big was like proposing a master planet sort of like scenario, which is kind of crazy. But what are your thoughts if that sort of master plan were to be more of a open source document? And what would be your thoughts if that sort of planning were to be led by more professionals and spearheaded by citizens instead of just like one singular authority?
Which plan do you mean?
The master planet plan, the one that was proposed by Big.
God. I even hate the name. Like the name is so disgusting. It's like, sounds like a matter of application. It's like only
it's like a new level of colonialism. But what would be your thoughts if that plan were to be led instead of one singular authority? If it would be more of like an open source document, kind of like how a lot of 3D printing projects have been worked out in several years.
Yeah, but I mean, to make the answer short, that thing exists. I mean, ecological scientists, cultural scientists, they've been telling you what to do for a long time. Stop killing indigenous people, stop occupying the land, stop building architecture in general, right? Like stop building, we build enough. I don't think it's rocket science. I mean, the knowledge is there. What is really excruciating that is gonna come the archangels is gonna like make a presentation and then we're gonna run with the stupidity, right? Like Elon Musk is gonna say some really asinine thing and then everybody's gonna be, Elon Musk says that we're gonna implant, chips in the brain of a monkey to play video games, right? Like not knowing, like, or ignoring all the sort of like super racist legacy of genetic modification, of biopolitics, to use Foucault's term. The problem is that the ideas have always been there, but we don't listen to them. It's like, if we look at COVID, it's not like we need one genius to save us. We knew what to do all along. Like, wear a mask, stay with distance from each other, don't cough around, don't be an idiot, be sensible to the collective. What did we do in the US? Nothing, right? Make the opposite of that. So of course we're doing terrible. it doesn't need a genius. The idea of the single genius is the most stupid and selfish idea we can imagine, right? Because it's not like, it never worked like that. Can it make nice shapes? Yeah, you can make nice shapes. Do you want, do I want you to terraform the world? No, like nobody wants that. We don't need anybody to terraform the world. Like it is already it's terraformed already, right? All we need to do is like stop being our greedy and destructive and you know, and use the knowledge that is there. The knowledge is there.
I think there's a lot of problem in of course, in this approach, because again, it's like thinking, why do we need a new project? I think the problem we had is like also, and we know that like a lot of knowledge and relationship that we created with our world and environment specifically is born out of a, you know, modern ideology where there was really this split, right, between nature and culture, nature and human, which made us believe that we can conquer nature, that we can over extract from them, that we can really manipulate it, that we have a say, right? But for many, I mean, we can see around that, and this is really something that is really in the middle of a contemporary discussion about this topic, is like, we know that this kind of dichotomy is really harmful, and even if it's repeated more and more so, now we learn how to question it. And now we want to really approach like a kind of new perspective in understanding all the different components that really make the world, make the ecology, make the environment, and understanding that one piece cannot really be independent from the other. So that being said, again, when you have those kind of projects that pretend to have again like this kind of perspective that
I'm gonna provide this new solution to it. Like,
when knowing that, again, like as Cruz mentioned, like knowledges of how to deal with the earth and how, what is the like healthier relation to it has been there and is there in many different communities. And so again, you know, of course this project has been published so much because it's big, right? And it's it becomes like a very iconic project. But and also the fact of it's again like the individual, going back to the question of environment and living, and this type of project is like, we need to understand that the same as thinking that all the components cannot really be addressed independently, from each other, is knowing that we as individuals cannot really address those type of topic alone. That's why we really need the collective. We need the collective knowledge to do that, and the collective knowledge is built also through history. So it's such a bigger project than a master plan, let's say.
True. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think we can end it there. Yeah, it was so great having you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and everybody feel free to reach out. Nice to see you.
Nice to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.